The slap came so fast I didn't have time to react. My glasses flew off, shattering across the polished marble floor of the crystal tea room, right in front of 130 stunned, silent guests. My cheek burned, but what hurt far worse was the pain tightening inside my chest. Brianna, my daughter-in-law, had just slapped me in the middle of her own wedding, all because I refused to hand over the keys to my apartment. "That's the price you pay for being selfish," she screamed in my face before the crowd. "A woman your age doesn't need that much space anyway." Silence. The 500-square-meter hall sank into a terrifying stillness. No one came forward to help as I trembled, bending down to pick up the shards of broken glass. A few guests turned away awkwardly. Others whispered to one another, but not one, absolutely no one, dared to speak up for the mother-in-law publicly humiliated. My son, Darren, stood motionless like a statue. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if I were invisible. "You're not welcome here anymore," Brianna went on, smoothing out the pristine folds of her white wedding gown. "Darren and I need privacy to start our new life together. Your apartment will be perfect for us while we look for somewhere better." Her words dripped like venom. For months I had swallowed her snide remarks about my outdated clothes, my old car, my modest way of living. But tonight, she crossed a line no one was ever meant to cross. I slowly rose, feeling every gaze pierce through me like fine, sharp blades. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but inside, something in me shifted, irreversibly. That slap wasn't just a blow, it was the last drop. For years, I had lived quietly, choosing humility and discretion. I carried secrets no one, not even my son, had ever known. I pulled out my phone from the black handbag I had used for 5 years, not because I couldn't afford a new one, but because I had learned to value practicality over appearances, something my daughter-in-law clearly couldn't understand. I dialed a number I knew by heart. I hadn't called it in over a year, foolishly hoping I'd never have to again. "Isaac, this is Regina. I need you to come to the crystal tea room right now. Yes, immediately. Bring the documents. You know which ones. It's time they learned the truth." My voice trembled, but inside me was a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. "Are you sure, Mrs. Miles?" Isaac asked, his professional tone tinged with concern. "Once we do this, there's no going back." I glanced one last time at the ballroom. Brianna was laughing with her friends, probably boasting about how she had just put her useless mother-in-law in her place. Darren stood beside her, smiling faintly, showing not a hint of regret for what had just happened. "Absolutely sure," I said. 30 minutes, Isaac." No more. I hung up and walked toward my car, each step deliberate. For the first time in years, I was about to remove the mask I had worn to protect my family. For the first time, they would meet the real Regina Miles. And when that happened, when reality shattered their illusion of a perfect world, they would finally understand what regret truly meant. The parking lot was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows between the rows of cars. I sat down in my old sedan and waited. In 30 minutes, their lives would change forever. In 30 minutes, they would realize the biggest mistake of their lives, humiliating the woman who had cared for them far more than they could ever imagine. My hands trembled slightly as I held my purse. Inside was the broken frame of my glasses I had just picked up. I didn't throw it away. I kept it, as a reminder of the moment everything shattered, the night when the gentle, aging, silent Regina Miles died, and another woman, the real me, awoke. If this story touches you, subscribe to my channel to join me in the next episodes, where every boundary rebuilt is another step toward reclaiming one's dignity. But for now, can you guess what's inside the file Isaac is bringing? Enough to tear down an entire wedding in just a few minutes? Follow me to the next part. That day was a cold March afternoon in Philadelphia. I remember it clearly, because I was watering the small pots of flowers on the balcony of my apartment at the Air, looking down at Washington Square Park, blanketed in white snow. Bare branches reached into the gray sky like hands silently pleading for something. The phone rang. It was Darren. "Mom, I want you to meet someone very special." My son's voice held something both nervous and excited, exactly the way he used to sound as a child whenever something thrilled him. My heart warmed. It had been 2 years since Darren broke up with his ex-girlfriend. 2 years he buried himself in work and practically avoided all contact. "Wonderful, sweetheart," I said, my voice full of hope. "I'll cook something special." I spent that entire afternoon preparing braised short ribs, the dish Darren had loved since he was little. I tidied up the apartment, not because it was messy, but because I wanted everything to be perfect. I changed the tablecloth, the only one still new and unfaded. The doorbell rang at 6 p.m., and that was the first time I met Brianna Hale. She walked in with perfectly styled curls, high heels untouched by a speck of dust, and designer clothes that looked straight out of a fashion magazine. Her smile spread wide, but it never reached her eyes. "How cozy," Brianna said, her gaze sweeping across my apartment. That word cozy sounded no different from shabby. Her eyes slid over each item. The sofa I'd bought from a thrift store 15 years ago, the wooden table I had repainted with my own hands 3 times, the curtains faded but still sturdy. Even the old sneakers by the door made her lift an eyebrow slightly. I caught that look, the assessing, appraising look, as if she were pricing every single thing in this home and concluding that nothing was worth much at all. "Mom, this is Brianna," Darren said, eyes bright like a little boy showing off a new toy. "She's an image consultant who works with high-end clients." "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand. Brianna's handshake was light, quick, perfunctory, as if she had just touched something unclean. That dinner was a silent disaster. Brianna barely touched her food. She cut the meat into tiny pieces, pushing them around her plate but rarely bringing any to her mouth. "I'm watching my figure," she explained, accompanied by a strained smile. "My job forces me to maintain my image." I merely nodded, swallowing the feeling of being insulted along with the bite in my mouth. When I asked about her family, she answered curtly, "Parents in North Philly, not wealthy, seldom see each other." Then she quickly changed the subject. "What about you, Mrs. Miles?" She tilted her head, voice sweet but loaded. "How do you manage on a widow's pension? Must be hard, isn't it?" A chill ran down my spine. That wasn't the ordinary curiosity of a girlfriend trying to understand her future mother-in-law. It was a test, a survey, a probe. "I work part-time at a flower shop," I answered softly. "I live frugally." "I don't need much." She nodded, the smile still fixed on her lips, but something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment or disdain, I wasn't sure, but it was real. After they left, I sat quietly in the kitchen. The meal I had spent all afternoon preparing was nearly untouched. I picked up my phone, intending to call someone to pour my heart out. But call whom? Walter, my husband, had been gone for 8 years. I had few friends. I'd lived too quietly for too long. I put the phone down and looked out the window. Snow was still drifting down softly. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe she was just shy. Maybe I was being an overprotective mother. But then, Walter's words echoed in my head, the night we decided to live simply and hide our true wealth. "Regina, when people know you have money, they treat you differently. Some will respect you, but many will see you as an opportunity, a target." I had never imagined that warning would one day ring true in the case of my own son. In the weeks that followed, Darren kept visiting, but never alone. Brianna always came along, always smiling, always accidentally asking questions that left me speechless. "Mrs. Miles, the maintenance fees in this building must be high, right? At your age, doesn't that feel heavy?" Your car is old. Buy a new one. It's safer. You're still working at the flower shop? You should rest. Older folks need to conserve their strength. Each sentence was a tiny needle pricking my pride. And then came what hurt me most, when Darren himself started repeating those lines. Mom, Brianna's right. You should move somewhere smaller. Mom, your car is really old. I worry about you. Mom, stop working. Take a break and let us take care of you. My son's voice was full of concern, but it no longer sounded like the boy who used to hug his mother every night after his father died. I felt I was losing Darren, bit by bit, piece by piece. Then one night, all my suspicions were confirmed. Darren was in the bathroom. Brianna stood in the kitchen, speaking softly on the phone. I was in the living room, but the apartment was small enough that I could hear every word. Yeah, Mom. Her apartment is in a really expensive area. If I can persuade her to move somewhere smaller, we could live there until we buy our own place. She's so naive. She might even thank us for helping her. I froze. My heart seemed to stop. I forced myself to appear calm. When she came back into the living room, I was already seated, holding a teacup, smiling. Were you on the phone? I asked gently, as if nothing were amiss. Yes, with my mom. She was checking in on Darren. The lie slid out so smoothly, it sent a chill through me. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't let my guard fall asleep. Every time they visited, I was no longer the gentle mother welcoming her son home. I became the observer, tracking every gesture, every glance, every word. And then I began to notice more things. The way Brianna looked around the apartment like someone appraising a property. The way she accidentally photographed the balcony view. The sight of Washington Square Park, whose view alone was worth a fortune. The way she asked about rent prices, the building's resident list, even which units were vacant. One afternoon, I found Brianna in my bedroom, where she had no reason to be. She was opening the drawer of my desk. Oh, hi, sis, she startled. I was looking for tissues. Darren said they were in here, tissues in a desk drawer? Ridiculous. But I simply smiled. Tissues are in the kitchen, dear. I'll get them for you. I caught a flash of irritation in her eyes, then it vanished as quickly as it appeared. That night, after they left, I checked the drawer. Nothing was missing, but all the papers had been disturbed. Someone had been searching for information. I sat on the bed, the dim light falling across Walter's photograph. You were right, I whispered. But I never thought the one coming for the money would be the woman our son brought home. I cried that night, not out of fear or loneliness, but because I realized I was gradually losing my only son. And the worst part? Darren had chosen a side. Every time I tried to speak to him alone, Brianna intervened. Mom, Brianna feels left out when you and I talk privately. Mom, I don't keep secrets from my fiancé. Each sentence was another brick stacked up, building a wall between me and my son. And behind that wall was Brianna's laughter. I knew I had to act. But how? If I told the truth, would Darren believe me? Or would he think I was just a difficult mother, jealous of a younger daughter-in-law? Number. I needed evidence. I needed the truth. I picked up the phone and called Monica Chen, an old friend who used to work in real estate. Monica, I need your help. There's some information I have to verify. From that moment on, Regina Miles was no longer the gentle, long-suffering mother. She began to investigate. And what I discovered afterward erased the last illusions I had ever held about my family. It took exactly 2 weeks for Monica to gather all the information. 2 weeks during which I had to keep playing the naive mother-in-law. 2 weeks during which I still smiled every time Brianna showed up, arms full of real estate magazines and brochures for retirement homes. I'm just exploring options for you, Mrs. Miles, she said, spreading the entire stack across the coffee table as if this were a business negotiation. I want to make sure you have the best quality of life possible. I nodded, took a sip of tea, and observed. I observed the way her fingers stroked the edges of the pages. I observed the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward the balcony, the place that opened to the most beautiful view in Philadelphia. I even observed the rhythm of her breathing as she calculated something in her head. One afternoon, when the two of them went out to run errands, I knew full well it was just an excuse. I decided to do something the old Regina Miles would never have done. I walked into the living room where Brianna had left her handbag on the sofa. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I understood. This was an invasion of privacy. This was not right. But sometimes, to protect yourself, you are forced to do extremely uncomfortable things. Inside, a wallet, a phone, lipstick, and a small notebook. I opened the notebook. On the first page was a list, bold letters hitting me in the eye. Plan, the Ayer apartment. Step 1, build trust. Step 2, make her feel incapable. Step 3, propose helpful solutions. Step 4, persuade Darren to assist. Step 5, find an appraiser for the apartment. Step 6, schedule the move for after the wedding. Each line was a stab. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't the oversensitivity of an old mother. This was a meticulously planned scheme, recorded in the handwriting of the mastermind herself. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page. My hands shook so badly I had to take the shots a third time to get a clear image. The next page contained financial notes. The Ayer apartment, estimate $1.2 million to $1.5 million. If she sells, after senior care costs, at least $800,000 left. We can borrow from Darren after she moves out. My stomach knotted. I had to sit down to keep from collapsing. They had calculated every last dollar, and they were planning how to spend my money before ever getting their hands on it. Keys rattled at the door. I quickly put the notebook back exactly where it had been, closed the bag, and went back to the kitchen. When they walked in, I was at the sink, washing cups as if nothing had happened. "Mom, we're home," Darren called. "Oh, you're back." I turned around, forcing my voice to stay even. "I just made tea. Want some?" Brianna looked at me, suspicion flickering in her eyes for a split second. Then she smiled again. "Yes, I'd love some." That night, alone in the dark, I couldn't sleep. The photos on my phone felt like they were burning a hole in my pocket. I had evidence, clear evidence of Brianna's intent. But should I show Darren? Would my son believe me? Or would he be angry that his mother had gone through his girlfriend's things? I looked at Walter's framed photo on the nightstand. That kind face seemed to pose the question back to me. What do you want to protect? Your honor or the truth? I knew the answer. Walter would go to the end. He would find the whole truth before making a move. The next morning, I met Monica at a small cafe in Rittenhouse Square, far enough from the places Darren frequented. Monica arrived with a thick file. The look in her eyes told me there were things that wouldn't be easy to hear. "Regina," she said, her voice grave, "I don't know where to start. What I found is much worse than you think." She opened the file. The first page was Darren's credit report. Annual income, $45,000, sales manager at a mid-sized company. Credit card debt, $83,000. 3 cards closed for non-payment. 2 personal loans past due. Credit score, 520. Very poor. "How is that possible?" I whispered. "He makes $45,000 a year. How can he owe that much?" Monica turned the page. Brianna Hale. Occupation, freelance image consultant. Actual income, about $18,000 per year. Personal debt, $42,000. Work history, terminated at 3 places for inappropriate conduct. Too vague to extract more details. "But there's more." Monica lowered her voice. "Brianna has a concerning history." She slid a printout from an old forum toward me, a post from 5 years ago by an account matching Brianna's name. Content. "The best way to climb socially is to marry the right person. You don't need love. You just need strategy." Below were a string of comments from the same account discussing targeting older men with assets and elderly parents as the easiest weakness to exploit. I felt sick. "And this," Monica said softly, turning to the last page. "Darren and Brianna are 3 months behind on rent. The landlord has sent an eviction notice. They have 30 days to pay or move." The final piece slid into place. This wasn't just greed. This was desperation. They weren't building a future. They were flailing, and my apartment was the only life raft they could see. "About the wedding," Monica went on, her voice hesitant as if afraid to hurt me. "The estimated cost is about $50,000, all on cards and quick loans. Deposit at the Crystal Tea Room $5,000, borrowed from a payday lender at 29% interest." I stared at the cold numbers. My son, the child I raised to value responsibility and honest work, was over $120,000 in debt, living beyond his means, planning a lavish wedding on borrowed money while 3 months behind on rent. And their solution? Take my home. "Regina," Monica placed her hand lightly over mine. "What are you going to do now?" Good question. I could flip the table right then, lay the evidence in front of Darren, and hope he'd wake up. But I knew my son. He was already too tangled in the vines Brianna had wrapped around him. She would argue, deflect, tighten her hold on him even more. I needed another path. "Can you dig further?" I asked. "I need to know exactly everything they're planning." "Every conversation, every email, if possible." Monica nodded. "You want me to hire a private investigator?" "Yes." "But Regina, this will be expensive and time-consuming. And it might hurt. Are you sure you want to know everything?" I thought of the slap in the future I didn't yet know about. I thought of that night at the Crystal Tea Room. I thought of the moment everything fell apart. "Find everything," I said. "I don't want to miss a single thing." 2 heavy, leaden weeks passed. Outside in Washington Square Park, the snow gradually melted, revealing blotches of gray-brown grass. Inside the air, I kept playing the unruffled mother, the smile at the right moment, the question at the right time. Brianna still accidentally left retirement home brochures on my table, still took souvenir photos on the balcony, still asked me, "Do you find the fire escape a bit inconvenient for older people?" Each of her questions was a stake hammered along the road to driving me out of my own home. I waited. I was patient. I knew Monica would come back with answers. And then, on a windless afternoon, the doorbell rang. 2 weeks later, I received a thick envelope from Monica. Inside was the private investigator's report. I took the envelope home, made a cup of tea, and sat down on the old sofa, the very one Brianna always eyed with contempt. I opened the envelope. The first lines shattered my heart. The investigator had recorded multiple conversations between Brianna and her friends. She referred to Darren as the Darren Project, speaking as if my son were an investment. "Darren isn't my dream guy," she said over the phone. "He's a bit older, not the most attractive. But his mom has assets, and more importantly, no siblings to compete for the inheritance. This is a long-term investment." A voice on the other end laughed. "What if the old lady refuses?" "Then we find another way," Brianna replied. "There are plenty of methods to declare an elderly person incompetent." I've done the research I had to set the papers down. My hands were shaking too hard, but it wasn't over. The report showed that over the past 6 months, Darren had called multiple banks and insurance companies to ask about loans taken out against an elderly parent's assets. My son had even asked about procedures to obtain financial power of attorney for a senior. My son, my own flesh and blood, had been quietly planning for months to strip his mother of her financial autonomy. The investigator also traced a chain of emails between Brianna and her mother. Brianna's mother. "Are you sure she has money?" "I don't want you marrying the wrong person and ending up with nothing." "Brianna, I've checked. The Ayer Parkview unit. Minimum $1.2 million. Enough to solve all my problems." The final section of the report cut deepest. Over the past 3 years, since Darren's finances began to unravel, I had secretly deposited money into his account. Those unexpected bonuses at work? That was me. Those special tax refunds? Me. The rent discount he bragged about negotiating? I wired it straight to the landlord. 3 years, $162,000. I had funded my son's extravagant lifestyle, thinking I was helping him through a rough patch. In reality, I had only been feeding his dependence. I had shielded him from consequences, and that very shield had destroyed him. I sat motionless in the quiet apartment, clutching the file like a confession. For the first time in years, I cried like a child. Not because of the money, not because of the apartment, not merely because of the betrayal, but because I had lost my son. The Darren I knew, the boy who once stood up to protect his mother, who chose what was right, was gone. In his place stood a man I didn't recognize. The phone rang. Darren. Mom, Brianna and I want to see you. It's important. Tomorrow, okay? We'll come by at 6. His voice was taut. Okay, sweetheart, I replied, strangely calm. I'll make dinner. I hung up and looked at the report on the table. I understood what tomorrow's meeting would be. An ambush. Their last attempt to take my apartment before the wedding. I picked up my phone and dialed another number. Isaac, this is Regina Miles. I need you to prepare some documents. Legal documents. I think we're about to need them. It was time for the naive, gentle Regina Miles to disappear. And for the real woman, the one even Walter rarely saw, to step into the light. I spent that entire afternoon preparing for what was likely the most important meeting of my life. Not preparing dinner, though I still cooked short ribs, like I always did, but preparing myself. Preparing for the moment I would have to look my son in the eye and accept that the child I loved was no longer the same. I deliberately wore my oldest clothes, a faded sweater bought from a thrift store, khakis with knees patched twice. I wanted them to see exactly the image they expected, a poor, frail old woman, easy to manipulate. At 5:45, the doorbell rang. They were early, the first sign of a carefully scripted plan. I opened the door. Darren stood there, forcing a smile. Beside him was Brianna in a sleek black suit, the armor she wore, and behind them were 2 people I had never met. Mom, Darren said, his voice too cheerful to be natural, I want to introduce you to Brianna's parents, Mr. Richard and Mrs. Margaret Hale. A coordinated ambush. Brianna's father was a burly man in a cheap suit pretending to be respectable. He entered with the eyes of someone appraising an asset. Margaret was gaunt, with heavy makeup. Her cold eyes swept over me as if I were an annoying insect. Very pleased to meet you, Mrs. Miles, Margaret said, her voice sweet as sugar, but not warm at all. Brianna has told us so much about you. I was sure she had. We sat in the living room. I had made tea and set out a plate of cookies. They sat in a row on the sofa opposite me, a united front. I sat alone in the old armchair, an elderly, solitary woman facing 4 people who'd come to take what belonged to her. Mrs. Miles, Richard began in a rehearsed tone, we'd like to talk to you about your future. My future? I repeated, feigning innocence. That's right, Margaret continued, her smile never touching her eyes. We believe it's time for you to make responsible decisions about your life. Brianna sat between her parents, clutching Darren's hand. My son kept his head down, unable, or unwilling, to meet my eyes. At your age, Richard went on, living alone in such a large apartment is not only excessive but also dangerous. What if there's a medical emergency and no one discovers it for days? Each word was laid out smoothly, too smoothly to be spontaneous. We've done quite a bit of research, Margaret said, pulling a stack of brochures from her purse. There's an excellent senior facility in West Philadelphia, round-the-clock medical care, social activities, full meals. You'd be safe there. The brochures spread across the table, a thin screen obscuring the view between us. I looked at the glossy images of smiling seniors playing bingo and eating communal lunches. A prettily decorated prison for those their families wished to discard quietly. "Mrs. Miles," Brianna spoke for the first time, her voice soft as honey. "This isn't just about the apartment. It's about your health. We worry about you." I looked up at her. In those brown eyes, there wasn't a trace of genuine concern, only calculation, only greed. "And you've already done the math, haven't you?" I asked, so lightly it was like a breeze. Richard shifted, momentarily unsettled. "Yes, we want to make sure you have enough resources." He pulled out another prepared packet, figures, charts, everything in order. "This facility runs about $2,500 a month," he said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "If you sell this apartment, you'll have years of coverage, and there would be some left over to, help Darren and Brianna with the costs of starting a marriage." There it was, the naked truth spoken aloud. They wanted me to sell my home, move into a nursing facility, and hand them the remainder. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice still gentle. The room fell silent, a thick, congealed quiet. Finally, Darren spoke, his tone like he was reading from a script. "Mom, we hope we won't have to resort to stronger measures, but if your mental health declines to the point where you can't make reasonable decisions—" My son didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. If I didn't comply, they would seek a legal route to declare me incompetent. They had done the research. They had a plan. They had laid out a path to use the law to strip me of what was mine, if necessary. My son, my own flesh and blood, sat there while outsiders menaced his mother. "I understand," I said softly. Margaret smiled, as if the deal were sealed. "That's wonderful. We can start arranging things right away. I know a real estate agent who—" "But I need time to think," I cut in, as lightly as setting a teacup on its saucer. The smile died on her lips. "Time? How long?" "Until after the wedding," I said. "Give me until after the wedding to decide." Brianna flicked a quick glance at her parents. A silent exchange. They didn't want to wait, but they also didn't want to push so hard I'd push back. "Fine," Brianna said, voice still sweet but steely. "But right after the wedding, we need your final answer." "Of course," I nodded. When they fell quiet, only the ticking wall clock remained, like a countdown. I could feel the four of them breathing in the small room, dense and heavy. 3 weeks. 3 weeks for them to believe I was weak. 3 weeks for me to arrange everything with Isaac Porter, every word, every clause, every exit. I took a sip of cold tea, pretending my hand shook. But inside, all the pieces had fallen into place. By then, they would have no idea that the woman sitting before them today, the one they considered prey, was the very person digging the grave for their plan. They left soon after, the air thick in their wake. As the door clicked shut, I leaned against it and exhaled a long breath. My hands trembled like leaves. They had prepared everything, a detailed plan, even a lawyer ready to push incompetency proceedings. These weren't panicked kids making a rash mistake. These were systematic predators, and I was the prey. I went into the bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, where I kept the most important things. Inside was a small metal box. I opened it. Bank certificates, $5.4 million in investment accounts. Title documents for an office building right in the center of Philadelphia, 1 Liberty Place, bringing in $50,000 in rent each month. Papers for a beachfront house in Cape May I had bought 10 years ago as an investment, and a letter. The last letter Walter wrote to me before he passed. I opened it, though I knew every word by heart. "My dearest Regina, if you're reading this, I've likely already gone. I hope our final years together were full of joy. We chose to live simply and keep our wealth hidden. That decision protected us from many troubles, but it also placed a burden on you. loneliness, and the pain of not being able to be truthful with family. Remember, money does not define you. How you use it, to protect yourself, to help others, to teach our children the true values, is what defines you. If you must make difficult decisions, especially with family, don't forget, loving someone does not mean allowing them to hurt you. Sometimes, the highest form of love is setting boundaries. I'm always proud of you, Regina. Whatever path you choose, always loving you, Walter. I folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. Walter was right. It was time to draw a line. I picked up the phone and called Isaac Porter, my financial advisor and attorney. Isaac, it's Regina. I need you to prepare the files. Everything we discussed. Are you sure, Mrs. Miles? Once we do this, I'm absolutely sure, I cut in. Prepare everything. The wedding is in 3 weeks. After that, they'll know the truth. I hung up and stood at the window, looking down at Washington Square Park. The streetlights had just flicked on, casting warm golden circles onto the dark. Behind me lingered the smell of a dinner no one had touched, the scent of braised meat, toasted bread, the scent of maternal love refused. I looked down at my hands, 68 years old, etched with wrinkles and brown spots, hands that once held Darren when he was a newborn. That gripped Walter's hand one last time, that worked steadily for a lifetime to build a safe life. And now, these very hands would have to do the hardest thing. Let go. Let go of the illusion of a happy family. Let go of the hope that Darren would come to his senses. Let go of the person I used to be, the woman who was afraid, who always yielded her share to others. In 3 weeks, at the Crystal Tea Room, in front of 130 guests, the old Regina Miles would die. And the real woman, the one Walter loved, the one even I had forgotten, would be reborn. I did not yet know that this rebirth would begin with a slap that would change everything, a slap that would set me free. I turned away from the window and began clearing the table. The leftover food would be thrown out, the dishes would be washed, and tomorrow morning I would wake up and continue the act. Only 3 weeks left. 3 weeks to prepare for the moment everything shattered. 3 weeks until they discovered that the frail, elderly woman they intended to exploit was, in fact, the most powerful person in the room. And when that moment came, I would be ready. 3 weeks can feel long or short, depending on what you're waiting for. For me, it was both. Each day stretched like a year, as I had to keep playing the role of a naive, frail mother. But at the same time moved too fast, because I knew every passing day brought me closer to the moment I might lose my son forever. The first week was the hardest. Brianna called every day, her voice sweet as honey. "Mrs. Miles, I just wanted to check whether you've thought any more about what we discussed." She never said the words apartment or nursing home outright. It was always vague phrases that sounded like concern, but were in fact velvet-wrapped blades, as if merely avoiding the truth could make a cruel act feel gentler. "I'm thinking, dear," I answered, like a sad refrain. "Give me a little more time." One afternoon, Darren came to visit, something rare. I hoped this would be the last chance to reach my son, to remind him of who he once was. We sat on the balcony, each holding a cup of tea. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry leaves from the park below, and memories blew in like a cold gust. "Do you remember," I asked gently, "how you used to sit out here with me every Sunday afternoon? You'd tell me about your friends, school, your dreams." Darren stared out at the park, avoiding my eyes. "I remember, Mom. Back then you said that when you grew up you wanted to be good like your father. You wanted to help people. You wanted to do what's right." My son's jaw tightened. "What are you trying to say?" "I just want to ask, is my boy still there? Or have you already lost him?" Darren stood up abruptly, nearly spilling his tea. "You don't understand. You don't know what the pressure is like. Debts, expenses, work, and Brianna. What does Brianna want, Darren?" I cut in. "What does she truly want from me?" "She wants to help you," Darren shot back, defensive. "We all want to help you." Why can't you see that? I looked at him and said softly, "If you want to help me, why do I feel like I'm under attack?" Darren fell silent. His fists clenched tight. "I love you," I whispered. "I will always love you, but I don't recognize you anymore." "Maybe because I've changed," Darren replied, his voice cold. "I've grown up. I have my own life. I can't always be the boy on this balcony." He turned away and went inside without saying goodbye. I remained seated, watching the dark swallow the park. A small piece of my heart broke off. That was the last time we spoke alone before the wedding, the last time I tried to save my son. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the apartment, looking at the framed photos on the wall. A photo of Darren's graduation, one of him and Walter fishing at the lake, one of me holding him as a baby. They were all still there, but the one thing missing was true love. I asked myself, how many mothers in this world have had to watch their own child turn into a stranger right before their eyes? How many have quietly wondered, how did I raise my child so that one day he would turn around and hurt me? I couldn't find the answer, but I knew one thing. If motherhood could no longer protect me, then justice would. In the second week, the pressure intensified. Brianna began to happen to drop by the apartment at different times. Each visit came with a new reason. I was nearby and thought I'd stop in to say hello. "I brought a few new brochures for senior facilities. I just want to make sure you're okay." But I could clearly see the way she looked around, as if appraising. The way her fingers brushed lightly over my belongings, as if inventorying. The way she accidentally raised her phone, as if gathering evidence. One morning, I saw her talking to Mr. Franklin Boyd, the 70-year-old neighbor who'd lived next door to me for 8 years. "Have you noticed any strange behavior from Mrs. Miles?" Brianna asked, feigning concern. "I worry about her. Sometimes I think she's starting to forget things." Mr. Franklin fixed her with a sharp gaze. "Mrs. Miles is the sharpest woman I know." "She remembers more than the rest of us combined." Brianna forced a smile. "I'm just worried, that's all." That evening, Mr. Franklin knocked on my door. "Regina," he said, "I don't want to meddle in family matters, but that girl is trying to build a case against you. She's asked at least 3 other neighbors about your unusual signs." I nodded, steady. "I know. I'm watching." "What are you going to do?" he asked, worried. "I have a plan. But I need you to help with one thing." I told him everything. About Isaac Porter, the documents, the plan for the wedding. "If anything happens before then," I said, "I need you to testify, to confirm that I am completely lucid." Mr. Franklin took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Regina, I'll do anything you need. You're family to me." His words made me want to cry, but tears wouldn't change anything now. "Thank you," I whispered. The third week was madness. The wedding was 7 days away, then 5, then 3. Brianna called constantly, her voice losing patience. "Have you decided yet, Mrs. Miles? We need to know. The wedding is almost here." "I'm still thinking," I repeated, like a protective mantra. 2 days before the wedding, they came again. Brianna, Darren, her parents, and this time, someone new. Attorney Edwin Price, who specialized in elder law. It sounded dignified, but in reality, it was the business of legitimizing the stripping of elders' rights. "Mrs. Miles," he said, opening a file, "your family is concerned about your decision-making capacity. I'm here to explain the legal options to ensure your safety." "Legal options," I echoed. "You mean the ways to strip me of my rights if I don't agree?" He hesitated. "That is one way to put it." "No," I cut in. "That is exactly what you're saying." Silence filled the room. Brianna shot to her feet, voice almost a scream. "Why do you keep delaying? Why can't you accept what's good for you?" I met her gaze, my voice calm but ice cold. "Because this is my life, and only I may decide what is best for me." No one spoke. The air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Finally, Darren stood, his voice hard. "Mom, if you can't make a reasonable decision, then maybe you're proving why you shouldn't be the one making it." The words twisted into my heart like a blade. The person standing before me was no longer the son I had raised. They left in anger. Attorney Price left his business card on the table, the calling card of a verdict to come. When the door closed, I sat in the dark, and I cried. I cried for the son I had lost. I cried for the family that had died long ago. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who believed love could save everything. But the next morning, when sunlight slipped through the curtains, I dried my tears and began to prepare. Isaac arrived with the final documents. "Everything is ready, Mrs. Miles. All transfers have been suspended, the lease guarantee canceled, and payment to the Crystal Tea Room has been stopped. Your signature is all that's needed to put this into effect." I looked at the papers, each a strand I had woven over years to protect my son, and now I would cut them one by one. "What about the new will?" I asked. "It's prepared," Isaac replied. "All assets once designated for Darren Miles are now assigned to funds that protect seniors from family abuse." I signed each page, my hand steady as steel. "Are you sure?" Isaac asked softly. "Once this starts, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said. "They chose this road. Now they'll have to learn their lesson." The night before the wedding, I sat alone in the apartment, an apartment Brianna was hungry to seize and Darren was willing to betray his own mother to obtain. I opened an old photo album. First page, newborn Darren, tiny in my arms. Next, Darren's first day of school, grinning brightly. Then, Darren's high school graduation, between me and Walter. Last page, Darren 2 years ago, still the gentle son he'd been before Brianna entered his life. I brushed each photo lightly, then closed the album. Those memories were now only ash. I stood and chose my outfit for the next day. An old black dress, a mended wool coat, worn-out shoes. I wanted them to see precisely the image they believed was true. A poor, harmless old woman, easy to lead by the nose. They would laugh, confident, thinking they had won. They would have no idea that old woman was carrying a bomb in her worn handbag. I laid the dress on the bed, turned off the light, and lay down. Tomorrow, the weak Regina Miles would die, and the true woman, the one Walter loved, the one I had forgotten, would step into the light. I just didn't yet know that this rebirth would begin with a slap, a fateful slap that would change everything, forever. If you've ever faced relatives trying to seize what you rightfully deserve, would you choose silence, or would you stand up like Regina Miles? Leave a comment and subscribe to join me as we step into the fateful night at the Crystal Tea Room, where every secret will be exposed. I arrived at the Crystal Tea Room at 5 p.m., 1 hour before the wedding. Not because I wanted to be early, but because Brianna had called in the morning, voice sweet but commanding. "Mrs. Miles, could you come early to help me? I want to take a few family photos before the guests arrive." I knew this wasn't about photos. This was the final push to force me to decide. The taxi dropped me off in front of the historic building on Chestnut Street, the Crystal Tea Room, one of the most expensive wedding venues in Philadelphia. Soaring ceilings, massive crystal chandeliers, gleaming wooden floors. A place a couple owing more than $120,000 should not be able to afford. But I knew how they'd made today happen. The deposit paid with borrowed money, and for the rest, they were betting on the naive mother-in-law. I walked in, gripping my old black handbag. Inside were only my phone and the broken glasses, everything I needed. Brianna hurried over, radiant in an $8,000 white wedding dress. Later, I would learn it was bought on a credit card that had already been closed. "Mrs. Miles! You're here!" She hugged me. A cold, quick hug, without warmth. "I'm so glad you made it." Darren stood behind her in a black tuxedo. My son looked very handsome today, but his eyes were empty, like someone who had sold his soul and was just waiting for the deal to close. "Sweetheart," I said softly, reaching to touch his cheek. Darren stepped back half a pace, small but unmistakable. "You look, well, Mom," he replied in a polite, social tone. "No, you look beautiful, Mom." "No, Mom, my love, only chilly courtesy." "Hey!" Brianna cut in, pulling me toward a corner of the room, away from the trickle of arriving guests. "I want to talk to you for a bit." "About what we discussed." We stood by a large window overlooking the street. The sunset poured in, casting long shadows across the wood floor. "Have you decided?" Brianna asked, no longer pretending to be gracious. "About the apartment. About the plan to move. We need an answer today, Mrs. Miles." I looked straight into her eyes. In that deep brown now, there was only calculation, greed, impatience. "I've decided," I said quietly. Brianna's face lit up. "Wonderful! So I'm keeping my apartment. I'm continuing to live there, and I'm not moving into any nursing home." Her smile froze. "What did you say?" "I said no," I repeated, light but firm. "The answer is no. And it will always be no." In the blink of an eye, I saw the polite, caring mask flake off Brianna's face. Underneath were anger, contempt, and something more dangerous. "You can't do that." She lowered her voice enough that others wouldn't hear, but sharp enough to slice the air. "You promised to think about it. You know we need—" "What do you need?" I asked bluntly. "My money? My home? My life?" Brianna glanced around to make sure no one was paying attention. She leaned in, her voice a serpent's hiss. "Listen, old woman. Darren and I have worked hard for this relationship. We put up with your boring dinners, put up with your old apartment, put up with your tedious personality, all as an investment in the future. And today, on the most important day of my life, you dare say no?" "Yes," I answered simply. "I dare." Brianna's face flushed. Her hand clenched, nails digging into skin. "You'll regret this," she growled. "We have a lawyer. We have a doctor ready to sign off that you're incompetent. We have neighbors who'll testify about your strange behavior. You think you can beat us? You, a lonely old woman?" This was the moment the mask fell completely. Brianna stood revealed. "I think I can," I said, "because contrary to what you believe, I'm not alone. And I'm not weak." "What are you?" Brianna scoffed. "An old lady who works at a flower shop." "You have nothing. Perhaps you should hand me the keys right now." She held out her hand. "Before things get worse." And then it happened. I didn't hand over the keys. I simply stood still, calm, and that calmness drove her mad. The slap came so fast I couldn't react. Smack! The sound detonated in the grand hall. My glasses flew off, struck the wooden floor, and shattered. 130 guests, who had just been laughing, clinking glasses, taking photos, fell abruptly silent. My cheek burned. I tasted blood. My lip had been cut when my head snapped to the side. But the pain in my cheek was nothing compared to the pain in my heart when I looked at Darren. My son stood 3 meters away, watching everything, and did nothing. He didn't run to steady his mother. He didn't shout at his wife. He didn't even move. He stared at the floor as if I were invisible. "That's the price of selfishness!" Brianna yelled, her voice ringing through the hushed room. "A woman your age doesn't need that much space." I touched my cheek, hot, wet. When I drew my hand back, blood streaked my fingertips. The diamond ring on the bride's hand had cut my skin. I slowly sank down, hands trembling, picking up the shards of my glasses. No one helped. Some turned away, unwilling to watch the shameful scene. Some whispered, in the thick silence, each word like a needle. Poor thing. The bride's right. She's too old to look after herself. She should have been in a nursing home ages ago. Judgments from strangers, summing up my entire life in a single moment, stabbed almost as sharply as the slap. I rose very slowly, the shard in my hand, feeling hundreds of eyes, sharp as blades. Tears ran down my cheeks, but inside, everything had changed. This slap wasn't just a blow. It was a release, an excuse to do what I was about to do without guilt. "You're no longer welcome here," Brianna declared, her voice high and clear for all to hear. "Darren and I need privacy to start our new life. Your apartment will be perfect for us." She said it openly, before 130 people. No more pretending to care about health or a better quality of life. Only the naked truth. They wanted my apartment and were willing to do anything to get it. I looked at Darren one last time. My son still didn't look back. In that moment, the mother in me died. And a new woman, Regina Miles, stepped into the light. I wiped my tears, slipped the shard into my handbag, and turned toward the door. Each step hurt, not physically, but because I was walking away from my last illusion of family. At the door I stopped, took out my phone, and dialed the number I had prepared. "Isaac, this is Regina. Come to the Crystal Tea Room right now. Yes, immediately. Bring the documents as discussed. It's time for them to know the truth." My voice shook, but within it was a steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. "Are you sure, Mrs. Miles? Once we do this, there's no going back." I glanced back at the ballroom. Brianna was laughing with friends, smoothing her wedding gown, probably boasting about how she had put the useless mother-in-law in her place. Darren stood beside her, forcing a smile, without a trace of remorse. And the 130 guests who had witnessed my humiliation had returned to their wine and their conversations, as if nothing had happened. "Absolutely sure," I said. 30 minutes, Isaac. No more. I hung up and stepped outside. The cool October air slapped my face. The parking lot was quiet. I got into my old sedan, the car Brianna always mocked, and waited. 30 minutes for their lives to change color. 30 minutes for them to learn who the frail old woman they had just slapped really was. I looked into the rearview mirror. A swollen cheek, a crust of dried blood. Red-rimmed eyes. But in those eyes was something I hadn't seen in a long time. Strength, resolve, and a strange peace, born of knowing that at last I was doing the right thing. I took out the broken glasses, studying the glinting shards. Each fragment reflected a part of my face, shattered but never erased. I would keep them as a reminder of tonight, the night the old, gentle, long-suffering Regina Miles died, and the real woman came alive. Inside the grand hall, the string ensemble retuned their pitches, glassware chimed, and the murmur of laughter returned like a fresh mask. Only 30 minutes stood between before and after, between pretense and truth. When Isaac Porter walked in, leather case in hand, the masks would fall. And when the masks fell, who would be the one left exposed? Headlights from a car cut across the rearview mirror. Isaac had arrived. Time for the final performance. Time for the truth. I opened the car door and stood. I felt all 68 years on my shoulders, and at the same time, younger than ever, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't acting. I was myself again, and that self was about to shake that entire room. "Isaac," I said as he stepped out, case in hand. "Let's begin." Isaac and I stepped back into the Crystal Tea Room. This time, I was no longer the timid, frightened woman who had left this place 30 minutes earlier. I walked with a straight back, my head held high, each step crushing down a steely resolve. The music was still playing, a joyful tune for a wedding reception. Guests were laughing, clinking glasses. Brianna stood in the middle of the hall, glittering in her white dress, her hand tightly holding Darren's. A perfect scene, until everyone saw us. The music stopped abruptly. The event coordinator recognized that something was seriously wrong. 130 pairs of eyes simultaneously turned toward the door. The realization spread like a ripple. Some people immediately recognized Isaac Porter. For 3 decades, he had managed the finances for Philadelphia's wealthiest families. His presence at a party usually signaled big trouble was imminent. Brianna reacted first. "What are you doing here?" she yelled from the center of the floor, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "You left!" Wasn't that dramatic enough? Her voice contained both rage and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isaac said in a professional, clear voice, "I apologize for the interruption. I have an urgent legal matter to discuss with Mr. Darren Miles and Ms. Brianna Hale." The silence that followed was so thick one could clearly hear the air conditioning hum. A few guests had pulled out their phones. The instinct of the social media age, they smelled a must-film moment. Darren stepped forward, his face pale. "What is this, Mom? Who is this man?" He still couldn't, or wouldn't, look directly at me. His gaze darted to Isaac, down to the floor, everywhere but the face of the mother whose cheek was swollen from his fiancé's slap. "Darren," I said, my voice unexpectedly steady. "This is Isaac Porter, my financial advisor and attorney." He has worked with me for over 10 years. Darren's face shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Financial advisor? You don't have—" "Don't have what?" I gently cut him off. "No money? No assets? That's what you wanted to believe, isn't it?" Isaac opened his leather briefcase, taking out the first set of documents. "Mr. Darren Miles," he began in an even, articulate tone, "this is notification that the financial guarantee your mother provided for your lease agreement is immediately revoked. Your landlord will be informed tomorrow morning. You have 30 days to find a new guarantor or vacate the apartment." All color instantly drained from Darren's face. "Financial guarantee? What are you talking about?" But Isaac didn't stop. "Furthermore, the monthly transfers of $4,500 your mother has been sending to your personal account are permanently suspended. This includes credit card payments, car insurance, and various other expenses you continued to believe came from other sources." A collective gasp swept through the room. Whispers erupted like fire catching on dry grass. Brianna let out a panicked cry. "No way! She's poor. She lives on a pension. Look at her clothes, her car." Her voice was on the edge of hysteria. She understood the claw of the plan was being broken. "Appearances can be deceiving, Ms. Hale." Isaac remained calm. "And you are about to see just how much." He turned toward the crowd, a deliberate move. I knew he wanted witnesses. "Over the past 3 years," Isaac spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Mrs. Regina Miles has transferred a total of $162,000 to cover the living expenses of her son, Mr. Darren Miles, and his fiancée. This includes $48,000 for rent, $44,000 for credit cards, $18,000 for car insurance, and $22,000 for miscellaneous expenses." The murmuring intensified. I saw a few guests pull out their phones to use the calculator, perhaps double-checking the figures. Mrs. Margaret Hale, Brianna's mother, slowly stood up, her face utterly white. "In addition," Isaac pressed on relentlessly, "Mrs. Miles has personally guaranteed the entire cost of today's ceremony, the venue, catering, music, flowers, photography, totaling $53,000. He paused, letting the figure sink into every gaze. $53,000 for a wedding. And the guarantor had just been slapped in front of 130 people. "And as I said," Isaac's voice dropped, sharp to the point of coldness, "that guarantee has also been revoked." Elliot Stein, the manager of the Crystal Tea Room, came forward from the back of the room, his face serious. "Mrs. Miles," he said, stressed, I have just received a very unusual cancellation notice for the payment. The contract for this event is guaranteed until tomorrow morning. Could you please tell me what exactly is going on?" His appearance brought the crisis to a head. "Mr. Stein," I replied, my voice strangely composed after the storm, "the guarantee I provided has been revoked due to the special circumstances that just occurred this evening." I tilted my head, letting him see my swollen cheek and the dried trace of blood. "As you can see." Elliot Stein looked at me, then at Brianna. A flicker of understanding crossed his face. "I understand," he said simply. "So who will pay now?" "The remaining total is $53,000, covering the venue, catering, music, flowers, photography." His tone was professional but firm, emphasizing that someone needed to resolve it immediately. Finally, Darren staggered forward. "Mr. Stein, there must be a misunderstanding." My mother. "She can't just cancel like this. We're family. Everything can be fixed." In his voice was the desperation of a man who finally understood. Too late. "Young man," Elliot said with the strained patience of a professional, "the guarantee was provided by Mrs. Miles personally and privately. She has the legal right to withdraw it at any time. I need an alternative method of payment immediately. Otherwise, I will be forced to suspend the event." The ultimatum dropped into the hall like a sentence. Brianna started pacing, clutching her head. "No way! It can't be like this. This is my wedding. You can't ruin my wedding day over money." She spun around to face me, stumbling in her long gown, her eyes distraught. "You're a poor old woman. You work at a flower shop. You drive a 10-year-old car. You can't have money." The statement bounced off the walls, echoing back as shame. "Appearances can be deceiving, Brianna," I replied, addressing her by her first name for the first time, not dear, not Ms. Hale, just a name, cold and distant. For many years, my husband Walter and I chose to live simply to protect our family's privacy and safety. It turns out we were right. It's just that the trouble came from an unexpected place. I turned to face the 130 faces, a mixture of astonishment, curiosity, and a little sympathy. "For 3 years," I said, my voice full enough to fill the room, "I silently helped my son and his fiancée, thinking I was helping them through a tough patch. I thought it was love." I paused for a beat, letting the words soak into the wooden floor. "But in reality, I enabled them to live beyond their means, avoid consequences, and look at me not as a mother, but as a walking wallet." Darren reached a hand toward me, his voice breaking. "Mom, please. There are 130 people here. There are photos, memories. You can't destroy everything just because of an argument." For a moment, I saw the child he used to be. But then, in the mirror next to me, I caught sight of the swollen cheek and the trace of blood. I remembered the feeling of being publicly slapped, and I remembered my son standing by and watching. "Darren," I replied, my voice soft but unmoving, "I am not destroying anything. You destroyed it when you chose greed over affection, manipulation over honesty, and stood by and watched me be humiliated instead of treating me with the respect I deserve." Each word was like a knife, but they were necessary cuts. "So what are we supposed to do?" Brianna burst out. Anger had turned to desperation. She looked around. Guests were picking up their bags, heading toward the door. Servers stood waiting. The manager checked his watch. "You will do what responsible adults do," I said clearly, enunciating every word. "Go earn honest money. Live within your means. Work hard for what you want, instead of demanding others provide it." My voice grew steadier. I heard within myself the capital of decades of experience. Isaac leaned closer and murmured, "Mrs. Miles, the legal procedure is complete. All documents have been delivered and explained. There is nothing more we need to do here." The message was clear. It was time to leave. to let them face the consequences without my presence as a final lifeline. But there was one more voice that needed to be heard. From the back of the room, a young, trembling voice. "Aunt Regina!" I turned. Ariel Boyd, Mr. Franklin Boyd's 29-year-old niece, had jumped up, 2 lines of tears glistening on her face. She had sat silently at a back table throughout the confrontation. She ran toward me. "Aunt Regina!" she cried. "I had no idea." "I swear Darren never told me what they intended to do to you." Ariel had always been the niece I cherished. She still visited, still called to check in, even as Darren drifted away. "I know, Ariel." I placed my hand on her cheek, my voice gentle as before. "You are different. You never looked at others as an opportunity to exploit." She nodded, crying harder out of shame for her cousin. "But why didn't you tell us about the money?" Ariel asked, genuinely confused. "Why did you keep it a secret all these years?" A question that deserved an honest answer. The room held its breath, waiting. The $53,000 bill was in the manager's hand. An abyss lay in the couple's eyes. And amidst the noise of speculation, only one thing remained to be said. Why I chose to hide my truth from the whole world. I looked at Ariel, then across the room. "Because money changes people," I said slowly. "I've seen families break over inheritance, friends cut ties over loans, and children view their parents as an ATM. Walter and I chose silence to protect what was more important, our dignity and our relationships." I paused, taking a deep breath. But today, silence no longer protects anyone. Today, I am forced to speak out, not to boast, but to end an exploitation. I turned to Isaac. He gave a slight nod. "I have said my piece," I concluded. "The rest belongs to truth and consequences." Isaac closed his briefcase. Elliot Stein looked directly at Darren and Brianna. A few guests had stood up, murmuring as they made their way toward the door. The music would not return. I squeezed Ariel's hand gently, nodding my thanks. Then I turned my back and walked away, without looking back. Today, the revelation was not an exposure of wealth. It was the moment I reclaimed my name, Regina Miles, and allowed Darren and Brianna to finally see, not a frail old mother, but a person with boundaries and values that could not be bought. I stepped across the threshold, and the October night wind swept in, cool, like a baptism. Tonight, the truth has been spoken. As for the lesson, they will have to learn it themselves. Ariel's question hung in the air, and I could clearly feel all the remaining eyes in the room awaiting an answer. Why keep it a secret? Why live like a poor person when you weren't poor at all? Why silently endure the criticisms about old clothes, an old car, a simple life? I took a deep breath, glancing around the room. The faces were watching, some curious, some judgmental. A few had begun to understand. Because Walter, my husband, and I learned a very expensive lesson a long time ago, I began, my voice low, as if unlocking a story kept hidden for years. When we were young and Walter's business started to take off, we showed off our success. Big house, luxury cars, expensive clothes. We wanted everyone to know we had made it. I paused, memories flooding back, the naivete, the pride, and the price we paid. People did find out. But they came to us not for friendship, but for opportunity. Relatives we'd never met suddenly appeared with financial emergencies. Old friends resurfaced, hands clutching amazing investment opportunities. Strangers knocked on our door with tragic stories and open palms. A few guests nodded faintly. They must have tasted the same experience. Worse, I continued, my voice growing hoarse, was the way money distorted the people we loved. Walter's brothers started seeing us as a private bank. My sister was embarrassed to invite us over for dinner, ashamed that her house was inferior. Friends were no longer comfortable, constantly worried whether we were judging how they spent their money. Money? I looked straight at Darren. Changes how people look at you. And it's not always for the better. Darren hung his head, not daring to look back. After Walter retired from his main business, we decided to retreat, to live simply, invest quietly, and keep our assets private. Not out of stinginess or an inability to give. For years, we have anonymously donated millions of dollars to charity. Isaac nodded in confirmation. He had handled many of those transfers. We lived simply, I stated clearly, to protect our privacy, to maintain genuine relationships based on affection, not our wallets. So that when someone was with us, it was because they wanted to be with us, not our money. My gaze rested on each member of the Hale family. Before he passed, Walter told me that decision would protect me. He was right. Except the biggest threat didn't come from strangers. My voice broke for the first time. It came from my own son. The room immediately felt heavy, as if the air had been sucked out. For 3 years, I wiped a tear, I secretly supported Darren, thinking I was helping him through a rough patch. I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to feel indebted. I wanted him to believe he was managing, that he was standing on his own 2 feet. But in fact, I confessed, I deprived him of the opportunity to learn. To learn about consequences, to learn about limits, to learn to distinguish between needs and wants. I turned fully toward Darren, no longer hiding the pain in my eyes. While I was shielding him from the rain and wind, I said, Brianna was teaching him a different lesson, that manipulation is acceptable, lying is acceptable, and treating an older person like an object is also acceptable. Brianna opened her mouth, but couldn't utter a single word. I failed you, Darren, I said, my voice tinged with regret. Failed by saving you too much, by not letting you fall so you could learn to pick yourself up, by turning a mother's love into a lifeline that you depended on, instead of learning to swim on your own. These words were painful to speak, but they were the truth. What I did not fail at, I gripped my hands tightly, my voice regaining its strength, was teaching you right from wrong, about respect, compassion, and how to treat others, especially family, with dignity. You know all these things, Darren. You simply chose to forget. Darren looked up, his eyes now welling with tears. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know where the rent money came from? I cut him off, my voice cold. Didn't know whose the credit card payments that fell from the sky were? Didn't know that for the past 3 years, while you worried less about money, someone else had to worry for you? Each question was a stab at his avoidance. Or, I lowered my voice, did you know, but just didn't dare to ask, for fear the answer would make you feel guilty? Darren was silent. The way he looked down said it all. On some level, he had always known. And the most painful part, I said softly yet louder than a shout, is that while I was silently caring for you, you were planning to take the only thing I had left to love, the home I shared with your father, the place where Walter closed his eyes in my arms, the place holding the memories of an entire marriage. The silence that followed was absolute. So, I turned back to Ariel. That's why I kept it a secret. Because Walter and I believed that living humbly would preserve what was most precious, I exhaled, my voice lowering. We were wrong. But not for the reason we thought. I looked around one last time. The faces that had just witnessed everything. A few phones still held up, the murmurs preparing to become an anecdote told for years to come. We were wrong, I concluded, not for hiding the money, but for believing that love and silent sacrifice were enough to hold a family together. It turns out, sometimes the highest form of love is not to keep giving, but to know when to stop. Isaac lightly touched my arm. Mrs. Miles, it's done. There is nothing more to say. He was right. I had said what needed to be said. The truth was clear. The documents were exchanged. The rest, the consequences, the hard choices, rebuilding or letting go, was no longer up to me. I turned away from Darren, from the woman who had slapped me, from the 130 people who had just seen me humiliated, and now witnessed how I rose up. Ariel took my hand as we headed for the door. "Don't go alone, Aunt. I'm coming with you." Near the exit, Mr. Franklin Boyd stood waiting, his eyes moist but shining. "Regina," he said, "you did the right thing." The three of us, Isaac, Ariel, and I, left the wedding hall that was slowly dissolving into chaos. The cool night wind brushed across my face like a new kind of freedom. This freedom came at a price. Sitting in Isaac's car, looking at the crystal tea room one last time, I wondered, will I ever see my son again? And if I do, will that person still be the Darren I once knew? Or is he already lost? 2 years have passed since that night at the crystal tea room. 2 years since the slap. 2 years since the truth burst forth. And 2 years since I accepted that I had lost Darren a long time ago. That night merely forced me to face it. This morning, I stand on the old balcony at the Air, looking down at Washington Square Park. Spring has dusted the walkways pink with cherry blossoms, falling lightly like snow. Behind me, the apartment is no longer as silent as it used to be. Ariel moved into the apartment next door a year ago, following her brief marriage. She is now the Director of Education for the Miles Foundation for Senior Rights, the foundation I established with the portion of the assets I had intended to leave to Darren. Mr. Franklin remains a close neighbor, now serving as the foundation's vice president. Every Saturday morning, we have coffee and listen as he recounts new cases, elderly people being pressured by their own family members. "Regina," he said last week, "you have turned your pain into purpose." That's rare. In the past 2 years, the Miles Foundation has helped over 400 cases. We have lawyers, social workers, psychologists, and a network of support that I wish I had back then. The book I wrote, When Love Becomes Control, An Elderly Woman Fights Back, has sold over 200,000 copies, with all royalties pouring back into the foundation. The letters from readers fill a filing cabinet, recounting their own stories. Where silence used to be the unwritten rule, only one letter has not arrived. No apology from Darren, no acknowledgement, no effort to reconcile. In 2 years, Darren contacted me exactly 3 times. The first time was after my interview on 6 ABC Action News, when his colleagues found out and changed the way they treated him. The second time was when Jonah Miles, my grandson, was born 14 months ago. The third time was 3 months ago when Brianna left, taking Jonah and half of their cobbled-together assets. All 3 times, he was asking for money. "Mom, if you could just help me one more time." "Mom, I have a small child now. I need—" "Is your pride more important than your grandson?" 3 times, I said no. Not because I am cruel, but because I learned an expensive lesson. Saving someone from consequences is not love. It's enabling. However, I did one thing. I set up a trust fund for Jonah, managed by Isaac, to be available when the child turns 18 for college, regardless of the family relationship at that time. Monica Chen, my friend, the real estate broker, said, "Jonah will find the answers on his own one day. Perhaps the boy will seek out his grandmother." I held on to just enough hope. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Mrs. Miles, it's Carmen Brooks in the office. We have 23 new cases this week." 23 other seniors, repeating the familiar scenario. Children pressuring them to sell their homes, grandchildren threatening to cut off contact if they didn't get money, relatives manipulating them, planting the idea that they were losing their competence. "I'll come to the office this afternoon," I replied. "Please prepare the files for me, Carmen." At 70, my life is more meaningful than it was at 68. I understand. Ending a toxic relationship is not a loss, but a liberation. Family, sometimes, is something you choose just as much as something you inherit, and it is never too late to write a new chapter. A knock came at the door. Ariel stepped in, handing me 2 cups of coffee. "You'll need this before tomorrow's meeting with the senators," she smiled. "Tomorrow, I will be discussing a new bill to protect the elderly from financial abuse. Next week, we are opening our 3rd regional center. Next month, I start filming a nationally broadcast documentary series. Life has purpose. It has impact. There is only one empty spot in my heart whenever I think of Jonah, the grandson I have never held." "Auntie," Ariel seemed to read my mind, handing me her phone. On the screen was a social media photo, Brianna with a short haircut, holding hands with a dark-haired little boy, Jonah. The child's eyes, even in the photo, were heartbreakingly like Walter's. The caption, "Single mother." Starting over. Grateful for a new perspective. No mention of Darren, no mention of the wedding, no mention of the old woman's apartment from that day. Just a young mother and her child, trying to forget the past. "What are you going to do?" Ariel asked. I looked for a long time. "Nothing," I handed the phone back. "Jonah is Brianna's and Darren's to raise. I've set up a fund for his education. The rest is not my business." But I took a screenshot, so that one day, if Jonah seeks me out, I can show him. His grandmother always knew, always cared, always hoped. In the afternoon, back at the foundation office, reviewing the 23 files, I paused at one case, Margaret Chen, 72. Her daughter convinced her to sell her house for her mother's benefit, and the money then turned into capital for a failed business venture and a European trip. I picked up the phone. "Carmen, arrange for me to meet Mrs. Chen tomorrow. Connect her with Monica. We need to review the daughter's finances. Each file is a mirror of myself. With every person helped, a part of me is healed. The sunset painted Philadelphia in orange-pink hues. I stood by the window looking at the 2-year journey, from the woman slapped in front of a crowd to the person contributing to changing laws, awareness, and lives. Isaac walked in with a stack of papers. "Mrs. Miles, please sign the files for the new center." I signed. Regina Miles is no longer the poor widow who worked at a flower shop, but a philanthropist, author, advocate, and survivor. Sometimes, to find yourself, you have to dare to lose a family. In the evening, I opened a drawer, taking out the broken glasses that Brianna had knocked to the floor 2 years ago. I kept them as a reminder. Today, looking into the broken pieces, I saw not shattered ruin, but liberation. Each shard reflecting a different ray of light, just like my life now. Multiple roles, multiple purposes, more connections than the single role of mother that I once held too tightly. I went out onto the balcony. Washington Square Park was quiet. Yellow lights sprinkled in warm circles. In that silence, a feeling I thought I would never have again quietly arose. Peace. Not because everything was smooth, not because Darren returned, not because the story had a fairy tale ending, but because, for the first time in years, I was no longer performing. I was not hiding. I was not sacrificing myself for those who didn't appreciate it. I was simply Regina Miles, 70 years old, strong, purposeful, free, and I was proud of that woman. My phone vibrated, a message from an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Miles, I'm Sarah Thompson. I read your book. I'm 75, my son. I think I need help. Can you meet me?" I smiled, a real, warm, purposeful smile. "Yes," I typed back. "I can, and I will." Because that is why I went through the pain, not to forget, but to turn it into something meaningful, so that other mothers, fathers, and grandparents are not alone in the storm. I put the phone down, looked at the park one last time, and closed the door. The apartment was warm, safe, mine. Not because I fought to keep 4 walls, but because I understood. There are things more important than brick walls: dignity, purpose, and the belief that you deserve respect. Tonight, I don't dream about what was lost. I dream about what still needs to be built. 2 years ago, the slap woke me up. Today, every rescue file keeps me awake. The question is no longer, what did they do to me? But, how many more people like me can I save? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow the next parts of the series, When Love Becomes Control, where we speak frankly about financial abuse in families and how to stand up. Leave a comment. What is the biggest lesson you learned?